Hello, welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists webinar series, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Louis Mantini, and I'm pleased to be the moderator for today's webinar. I'm an environmental scientist for the Swanee River Water Management District in Live Oak, Florida, and I've been with the webinar committee since 2017. Today's topic will be Vanishing Ice, Wetland Rehabilitation for Infrastructure Installations in Permafrost. And it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Laureen Lynn. Laureen is an applied scientist who provides ecological restoration services in Alaska as the owner of Red Mountain Consulting. Her work builds upon her graduate research studying permafrost soils along the eroding Beaufort Sea coast and extensive experience with rehabilitation in the North Slope of Oilfields. She provides expertise in planning, stakeholder engagement, construction, restoration implementation, long-term monitoring, and adaptive rehabilitation in the North Slope. Oilfields, that is. She provides expertise in planning. She provides expertise in planning, stakeholder engagement, construction, restoration implementation, long-term monitoring, and adaptive management to clients that include government agencies, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector. She formerly chaired the North Slope Science Initiative's Science Technical Advisory Panel and lives in Palmer, Alaska, where she enjoys skiing, hiking, and other outdoor activities. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Laureen. Thank you for being with us.
All right. Let's see. Hello. Thank you for joining today. And yeah, as you saw in my intro, I'm in Palmer, Alaska, and I'm just going to try to share my screen here. Okay. So today I am going to talk quickly just so that we have enough time for questions at the end of the webinar. And so I apologize ahead of time for going so quickly over things. So I wanted to talk about some of the work that I do up in the Arctic. I also do a lot of work down in South Central Alaska. It's kind of nice to be able to balance time between the North and the South for weather conditions and such. And the project I'm kind of focusing on today is a telecommunications installation that was put in to reach the North Slope oil fields. And I'm concentrating on the section between Coldfoot, Alaska and Dead Horse. And you can see in this aerial, it's a photo of, you can see the trenches on the left-hand side of the Dalton Highway there. And this project is also in collaboration with a bunch of other entities, Dowell and Northern Permafrost Consulting, the Woodwell Climate Center, Oakham Solutions, ABR, and the SCA. So just, this is my Alaska is cold slide. So I like to just show that the average annual temperature, now this data is a little old and of course things are warming. And so as things warm, this data is going to shift, but it's still quite cold, especially in northern Alaska. And so this talk concentrates basically in the pink region of this map. And so the top part of this slide shows how the northern part of Alaska is divided by land ownership. So in the western portion is the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska. This map unfortunately excludes some of the native villages and Alaska Native land ownership in Western Alaska. There are a few villages up in the NPRA is what we call it. And on the east, the pink part is the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. And in the middle, the not colored portion is state land. And that's where this talk is about. In the bottom half of the slide, it just shows the NWI mapping of the North Slope of Alaska, and just showing that pretty much you can assume just about everything is wetland. Of course, it's variable, riverbanks and such are not, but most of it is kind of blanket accepted as wetland. And then because it's cold, we have permafrost, and this map just shows the distribution of permafrost. Continuous permafrost just means that everywhere you look, you're going to find it. Discontinuous means that in some places you have it and other places you don't. And of course, isolated is self-explanatory. So I just wanted to just show some pictures of what permafrost soil looks like for those who aren't familiar with what permafrost soils are, which in US soil taxonomy are gelisols. And so on the left, you can see it's a soil profile, and I divided out the active layer, which is the portion of the soil that thaws each summer and then refreezes. Below that is the permafrost. So if you have this permanently frozen ground, it stays frozen for more than 2 years consecutively. Within a meter of the surface, you have permafrost. And then this feature right here is an ice wedge. And so in some places, you'll find these formations of ice wedges where it's almost pure ice. There is some soil mixed in, but it's mostly ice. In the right-hand picture where the shovel is leaning, you can see a rather massive ice wedge. And then in the soil, there's all different types of formations of how the ice is embodied within the soil. And so there's two soil cores present. One on the left shows difference between lenticular and reticulate ice, where it's just how the ice and the soil particles separate. And on the right, you have some ice lenses. And there's different ways that the ice forms. Oftentimes it's, if you think about a moist soil that gets frozen, the amount of water that's in the soil becomes ice, as opposed to the ice wedges where you actually have true massive ice. How it gets expressed on the ground surface, you see what we call polygonal ground. So there's the patterns. Hopefully my mouse is showing up. So I'm going to point to this patterned ground area. And each of those kind of the lines that you see on the ground, underneath those is where the ice wedges are. And so it forms in this kind of network pattern. And then of course, because there's ice under the ground all across the entire landscape, all the water that is traveling across this relatively low slope area, it's between 1% and 3% slope, it's held on the surface. It has nowhere to drain. And so it moves across the surface very slowly. And there's a lot of these oriented ponds as well. And so this project that I'm going to talk about, the restoration project, it's 240 miles long from Coldfoot, which is just on the very southern foothills of the Brooks Range, and goes all the way up to the Arctic coast. And just to give some context for those who are in the West who have an idea, it's a little bit further than from Seattle to Spokane. So it's quite a project to deal with. Also keep in mind that from Coldfoot down in the south, there's a fueling station and a place to get food and actually a beer. And then there are 0 services of any kind, except for a couple of latrines until you get to Dead Horse, where again, you can get fuel and food, but no beer. So I just wanted to mention just the types of disturbance I'm often dealing with. So in the oil fields, we deal with exploratory well pads. That's the upper left. And then the next one on the top row is a partial pad removal. So there's an active pad where part of the pad is removed and the gravel is removed. In the upper right is a former gravel pit. And so oftentimes the gravel pits are allowed to fill with water and become lakes. And so the restoration activities focus on the edges of the gravel pit. In the lower left is an example of a spill site, which I honestly don't deal with very often, but it is one of the types of disturbance. In the bottom middle is where a vehicle went off the road, and it happens more often than you might think, especially nowadays with cell phones. And in the lower right is trenches. And so oftentimes in the oil fields, trenches are dug in order to bury electrical lines so that large drill rigs can pass down a road where otherwise there was an electrical line going overhead. So these trenches will go from large power pole to large power pole, and that's the entirety of it. In this work, I'm talking about a telecommunications trench installation instead. When I was brought onto this project in 2020, I realized it was bigger than me, and that I wasn't going to be able to do everything that needed to be done, and nor did I have the knowledge specialties that were needed. So I brought in Anna Liljedahl, a permafrost hydrologist who works with Woodwell Climate Institute. And so she specializes in dealing with how water moves across the landscape. Christopher Stevens from Northern Permafrost Consultants. I'm sorry, Chris, that I don't remember the name of your business exactly, but he's also a small business like myself, and he does thermal modeling. So he can do predictions on if you put fill in a wetland at what time of year and what type of grain size, how much heat is going to be introduced into the ground, or if you're going to be able to reaccumulate cold and bring the permafrost table back up. Hydrologic engineering, we had a hydrologic engineer from Dow Engineers helping us with much of the culvert situations that were up there. And then when it came to revegetation, while I have that expertise, I knew I wouldn't have the time. And so my colleagues Sue Bishop and Tim Cater at ABR helped with the revegetation section of the restoration plan, the original restoration plan for this project. So there are a lot of challenges. We're working in the north. Sometimes you find salt crusts. They are sometimes naturally found in the soil, and when water evaporates from the surface, they come to the surface. It's not super frequent, but it does happen, and it can cause some problems with regrowth. It is a very short cold season. So that top middle picture is taken in July, just to give context that yes, it can snow in the middle of July. There's high ice volume in the soil. So you figure if an ice wedge melts, you get a giant void under the ground. There's often, the soil is very low in nutrients, especially in phosphorus and nitrogen. And so that can be a challenge. The texture is often silty. And sometimes it's just pure silt. Occasionally you'll find sands and gravels, but oftentimes it's very silty. And then finding sources of material, so something like tundra sod to transplant or gravel to extract is very difficult to find, and it's often far from the place that we need the materials delivered. There's also other limitations. As I mentioned, finding a material site is difficult. This was a site that the state said, yeah, go ahead and extract gravel there. Well, we went in here and there was almost no gravel to be had. It was an unfortunate situation, time, energy, and then the disturbance of the surface vegetation in this location. Off to the left in this picture is a much larger gravel pit, so it didn't mar the landscape away from another gravel pit. But the quality of the backfill is often not ideal, and we have to just kind of deal with what we have available in the locations we have available. For things like thermal insulation, there's options to use wood chips and such. There's no trees in the Arctic, and so it's very difficult to get wood chips trucked all the way up from somewhere like Fairbanks up to the Arctic. It's very expensive and often doesn't weigh out in its benefits. And it's just very remote. It's hard to mobilize our equipment, our people, to figure out our lodging and that sort of thing. So it is challenging from those perspectives. So in this picture, you can see an example of a spot in this telecommunications installation where there was massive ice under the ground. It's most likely that water started flowing on the surface because of subsidence, which subsidence is where the ground starts to settle because of thaw. And you can kind of see, if you run your eye away in the picture, you see an orange stake out there, and you can see that there's kind of a depression between the foreground of the picture and the background of the picture, and that's the subsidence along the trench. So as water migrates across the surface into this lower elevation, and if it starts to run against the massive ice, then you get not only like a thermal erosion, right, a change in temperature of the ice, but you also get mechanical erosion, that the water actually running against the ice will melt it faster, and we end up with a giant hole like this. So what do we do about a giant hole? Well, we can't replace the ice. So what do? We end up backfilling with gravel. And so the idea is that eventually the gravel materials will eventually adopt the soil attributes of a wetland. I have no idea exactly how long that's going to take. Another caveat on this whole thing is that there's not been a lot of research done on this kind of stuff. So we are the ones out there putting ourselves out there and figuring it out as we go. And so it can be rather startling to the eye to see a patch of gravel out in the middle of the tundra, but otherwise we'd have a giant hole that could probably expand and continue to expand beyond its area and make the problem much bigger than it was. So I wanted to focus in on one area that we discovered in let's see, this is 2022, and in the spring. And so you can see the Dalton Highway here. In this location, it was paved. in 2019, which was an unusual move, but it's basically because our State Department of Transportation cannot get money to do highway improvements without also paving it. So pavement is not an ideal situation up here, because if you get potholes, there's no good way to fix them, because you can't get hot asphalt up to the Arctic in a timely manner to fix potholes. And on the left, I'll show you in the next picture, that's the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline carries oil from the oil fields in the north all the way to Valdez on the southern coast of Alaska. It's 800 and some miles long. And in some sections, it's buried. So in this section, it is buried. I must say it's one of the engineering marvels of the world. They mostly got it right, exactly where to bury it, where to keep it above ground. In this particular spot, it maybe wasn't the best idea to bury it, only because it blocks the flow of water. So the project area that we're going to focus on is in the red box here. And I just want you to look at this photo at 2018. So the water is generally flowing from the upper left corner to the lower right corner of this photo. So it's oriented north is to the right in this photo. And the water is generally flowing north, but also flowing east, because there's a large river to the east of the highway here. So the water is trapped in between the pipeline and the highway. And it used to flow in this arc over the top and then out and beyond, and not interfere with the fiber optic lines. But as they started to subside, and then there's also effects from the highway itself that causes water collection and subsidence right up against the highway, water started to migrate towards the highway. In 2022, we found that water had completely migrated into the fiber optic trenches and washed away all the soil covering the fiber optic trenches. And you can see the silt that was moved downstream to the right in that stream bed. So in June of 2022, this is what we encountered. So the roadside tends to hold its snow much longer because of two reasons. One is wind drifting, and then also plowing. So you have more snow up next to the highway than you do in other places. So you get this kind of line of snow along the highway for a long time. So in June, you still have a lot of this snow. And when we looked out, we saw, you can see in the left-hand side of the fiber optic trenches, there's kind of a turbulent area of water. And that water was actually cascading from the level of the tundra down just a few inches into the fiber optic trenches, which started the erosion and the gutting. And so by August, you can see in the lower picture what it looked like. We've got the fiber optic lines floating and a new pathway for the water. So the big question was what to do. Another thing to point out is that the ground surface here, you can see it's kind of, it's like pockmarked. And if you look at the surface, it's got these little pools of water all over it. And this is a very unusual kind of new type of surface condition that you don't usually see, not up to this date, although it's starting to happen more and more as things warm. And as you walk on it, you can feel the ground bounce around you, and you know that things are likely going to subside and collapse all around in this area, and it's very fragile to any kind of change or disturbance. So the first thing we did with my Student Conservation Association crew is we went in, somebody had previously installed some straw wattles, and unfortunately, instead of installing them perpendicular to flow, as is the standard, they had installed them parallel to flow, which I think actually exacerbated the situation of erosion in this location. So the folks are digging them out of the silt and trying to retrieve as many of these straw wattles as they can, because they're also the kind of straw wattles that are netted in nylon. And so we just didn't want to have those basically little pipes sitting in the soil before we started our work. It was one of the muddiest days we've ever had. And there were a few very funny instances of people kind of getting stuck in that mud as we worked. At the same time, we had backfill being delivered to build up and backfill over the fiber optic trenches. And also you can see coming out of the bucket here is tundra sod, slabs of tundra sod. They're generally about 4 feet by 5 feet. Some of them are 3 feet by 4 feet, and they're anywhere from 9 to 12 inches thick. And so tundra sod is obviously much thicker than what you think of as when you think of grass sod for your lawn. And it's also very heavy because it's wet. So each one of these slabs we estimate weighs about 1,600 pounds, and that's why we move it with heavy equipment. You can see that the excavator is sitting on what we call tundra mats, and those are laid out to help distribute the weight of the heavy equipment and not let the tracks dig into the ground, because especially in this situation, that equipment would probably be buried up to its gills if it weren't sitting on the tundra mats. Tundra mat installation, it's hard to get the tundra mats there sometimes, and it also takes a really long time to set them up. They're all linked together. So it takes about 15 to 20 minutes to lay down each one of those mats. And we have a limited number of them, and we have to move them as we go along in our work. So there's a lot of steps in this work. So, and you see in the above photo is what the conditions were like on August 22nd. And in the lower photo, after we've backfilled and laid tundra sod over the top of all the fiber optic cables. The tundra sod serves a couple of purposes. One is it provides insulation. So the vegetation itself has some transpiration type effects that are cooling, but that's pretty minimal compared to the thickness of the tundra sod that is mostly organic matter. It's often about 30 or 40% organic matter in the soil of the tundra sod. And that provides really excellent insulation to the ground below. Heat can't penetrate, and you also don't get serious cold penetration, so you don't get big fluctuations in temperature, which also can reduce heaving. The tundra sod also, because of the root structure in the soil and the sod, you've got all these decomposed roots, and it's just very humic. And it also then provides some resistance to erosion. It's very hard to erode this type of tundra sod. And I'll talk about the harvest and movement of that in a little bit. But so this is a transformation. We realized we weren't going to be able to reroute the stream into its previous channel. There was just no way to access it. The ground was too soft. And so instead, we channeled the water just the other side of the tundra sod to keep it away from the highway and to protect the fiber optic lines. Okay, to talk about tundra sod harvest, we got lucky. So in 2020, when I was brought onto this project, at the same time, there was a project to raise the Dalton Highway by about 10 feet because of flooding issues from the river. So the highway had been washed out a couple of times in previous years, and they figured that by raising the highway that it would help prevent that, and at the same time they paved it. So we knew that there was going to be a giant new gravel pit opened. And so we went and approached them and said, hey, can we harvest the tundra sod off the surface before you go in and blast and build a gravel pit? They said yes. So we worked with a company up north that we've done other tundra sod harvesting with. And instead of using, we came up with a new tool. So we used to use something called a Nuna Ulu, which is basically like a giant pizza cutter. It's mounted on the end of an excavator arm, scores the ground, and then you scoop it up with an excavator bucket. Instead, these guys are great to work with, and they fabricated on this excavator bucket, they fabricated a cutting edge. And so they're able to set the bucket with its face down and press down on the soil, kind of like a cookie cutter. And then they can come in and scoop that piece of sod. It's kind of perfect because it cuts the sod exactly the size that you want for the excavator bucket. And this is just an example of where the sod's been harvested. It was really great to have such a good operator. It's really good to find really good operators and guys who really kind of, the only way I've been able to put it is that they get nature. They're not trained in science or anything like that, but guys who just have an affinity and a connection to nature tended to handle this type of stuff a little better. I have a video here I'm going to play of just the operation so you can see, and hopefully I can talk over the sound. We had to lay down, these are called rig mats. They're much bigger than those tundra mats and much heavier. Laid those out so the excavator could get out on the ground, and then started our harvest. And at first it was pretty slow getting it out. It's a little bit like cutting lasagna. The first piece tends to be very difficult to get out of the pan, which is the ground. And tends to be a little sloppy on its execution. But once you have that first opening, then the bucket can get in there and get other pieces more easily. We harvested in total 1.1 acre of tundra sod, and this took us about 25 days to do. So it takes a while. It's an expensive operation. And the timing of doing this is important because you want to time it at a time when the amount of thaw in the ground is the depth of the sod that you want. So when the excavator bucket goes to scoop the sod, it's scooping across the top of frozen soil. And so that's why some of it varies in depth, 9 to 12 inches. Part of it just has to do with variation on the landscape, and part of it has to do with thaw depth over the 20 some days that we did the work. We started getting pooling of water. So each piece of sod that was removed was set out on a pallet. The loader operator would come and grab it, put it on a pallet, and then we'd take it about 15 miles south to another state-owned gravel pad and unload the sod so we could have somewhere to store this 1.1 acre of sod for future use. This was also a lesson in figuring it out as we went. We figured out that we had to strap the pallets to the forklift in order to get the sod to slide off and not also end up with the pallet underneath the sod. We didn't want pallets underneath the sod for a couple of reasons. One is we didn't have enough pallets. And the other reason is we didn't want the air circulation underneath. And as they laid them down in the storage pad, it was imperative that we tried to push each piece up as close together as the other pieces, because any exposed edges or gaps tend to dry out, desiccate, the edge of the plants tend to die. And so the tighter we could get it pushed together, then the longer the sod would last. We predict that it'll last probably about 10 years. We're going on year 4 right now with some stored sod. So this is an aerial view of where we harvested the sod from. Now, keep this in your mind as I go to the next slide. You see the gravel pit, the old gravel pit across the access road there and the lakes, and you can see the footprint of where we harvested the sod. And now you can see the footprint of the gravel mine that was eventually built in this area. So our tundra sod harvest barely covered this central area of their operations. So yeah, the gravel pit ended up being really big, and all the remaining sod was just pushed into berms. And this is the standard, is to push it into berms along the edges of their work to try to prevent any thaw from migrating into the surrounding tundra. And this is an aerial view of the sod as it was first stored, the 1.1 acre of sod. We had some pretty funny jokes. We use CB radios and listen to the truckers as they go, so we can communicate with them when needed. And they were laughing. They were like, "What are they doing? Building a football field?" So we call this the tundra soccer field. And it turned out in 2023, I ended up doing a lot of hand labor, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And I found these trailers out here on this pad, and I looked into the ownership of them, and it turned out that they were abandoned, and they have bunk beds in them. And I said, well, can we use them as part of our camp? And so we set up a 6-week work camp right here with these trailers and such, which with the Student Conservation Association, which was an adventure for sure. Okay, so getting into hand sodding. So when we wanted to do hand sodding, we would get these slabs delivered to the side of the highway, laid on the embankment. And so we'd have these trucks hauling the sod to the location, and then an excavator unloading them and setting on the side. And then after that, we would cut them up with large bread knives. So think the kind that's used in like a bread shop. So they're deep and long, and with long handles, and the serrated blades cut through the sod really well. And it's an effective way to cut it into chunks that actually can be carried by hand. So in locations like this, in the spring, when all the snow is melting and there's a lot of free water on the surface of the tundra, a lot of it migrates towards the highway. So you can see the fiber optic trenches. There's 3 in the northern part of this project, and it tends to just be filled with water. And then to the right of it, to the east of it, there's another trench you can see, and that's a gas line that was installed in the 70s. And that gas line then supports the pump stations that are associated with the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And they also are dealing with this issue of collecting water and subsidence and everything. And you can see in the photo along a gas line a pile of gravel, and you can also see a line of subsidence where the pipeline has subsided underneath their backfill. So they're battling the same situation. Excuse me. So there was no way we were going to be able to fill the trenches with tundra sod. It would take too much sod, and it would take an enormous army of workers to do this work. So instead, what I did was I selected locations where ice wedge subsidence has cut in perpendicular towards the highway. And in the intersections where these ice wedges cross the trenches, we put tundra sod on either side of the ice wedges to prevent water from migrating in the trenches. As the water level subsides, it tends to channel in the trenches, and we were trying to prevent that and have it flow instead towards the highway and eventually towards a culvert. There are not many culverts on the highway, unfortunately. When the highway was built in the late 60s, or was it in the 70s? I'm forgetting what year it was built, but a long time ago, it was colder. And there wasn't as much free water in the spring. There wasn't as much snowfall. Precipitation is increasing in the Arctic, so there's more snow melt. And so where they put the culverts, there's just not enough of them for the conditions that we have now. And unfortunately, when I talked to the DOT about installing culverts, it's just kind of a financial impasse for our Department of Transportation. And besides, this is the one and only highway that gets to the oil fields, and the oil fields, there's truckers driving this highway all the time, delivering materials, food, everything else is needed for the oil fields on a daily basis. Okay, so let's see if we can get this video to play. And this shows the SCA workers out. You can see on the road embankment, there's a brown spot. That's where the sod was. It's been cut. They carry it out, and oh, it's really hopping around there. And then cut the sod to fit into the trench. Well, I'm sorry about the quality of this video. And you can see it goes on for miles and miles and miles and miles. So we had to be selective about where we chose to do this kind of work. This shows a delivery method one of my workers came up with, where we would pull up two trucks next to each other. One had the excavator and one had the sod, in order to deliver 1 or 2 or 5 slabs to the side of the road and then move on to the next spot. And then this just shows the hand sodding work that we do. So you can see they have their bread knives in hand. Oftentimes they'll go to the trench, measure the section that they need to cut with the bread knife, hold it, bring it back, set it at the sod, and then cut the piece to fit exactly what they need. So this is a lot of walking and carrying all day long. And each piece, when you pick up a piece that's about 12 by 12 inches, it weighs anywhere from 40 to 60 pounds. So it's a lot of lifting and carrying all day long. And I'm really grateful to all the really awesome, strong young people I had working for me to do this work. And then this just shows like a really narrow section of trench and somebody pushing sod down into the trench to block the water flow from entering the trench in this particular location. I went out ahead of time and flagged all the spots that I wanted them to do, because there was no way with all these people running around that I'd be like, oh, you need to put it here and there. So I flagged everything so they had guidance of where to put the sod. And then this video, luckily I had one guy who was really talented in filming. And so he filmed from inside the trench, putting a piece of sod in. And so that's basically what we're doing, is filling the gap. In this particular instance, it's not as tight of a fit as we'd like, and it's hard to get it exactly right, especially since the sidewalls of the trenches aren't always straight and even. You'll also notice that the trench is rather straight and even after 4 years after installation. And this just speaks to that quality in the soil I was talking about with the root mass and the humic nature of the soil, is that it's kind of hard. And so even after years, there were some spots that we looked at where we had taken plugs out of the soil, and 15 years later, the plug hole donation spots were like golf holes. The sides were completely smooth. It hadn't filled in at all. It hadn't grown back in. It's unrealistic to expect that this will fill back in any way unless there's silt moving down the line from some other location, which means that some other location is in trouble. We talked about how to maybe backfill this, but if any material we use would have to be something that would be non-erodible, which is very difficult to find up there. The North Slope is generally loess deposits, so windblown silt from the previous glacial era. It was not glaciated on the North Slope. There were no glaciers up there, but certainly there were some giant rivers and a lot of wind. And so there's these thick depositions of windblown silt. In a lot of the soils, you'll find the organic layer on top where you've got the live growth material. Then you have a layer of silt, and buried below that, you have a buried organic layer that grew prior to the last glacial age. and below that you'll find another layer of silt. So this cycle has been going on for a long time, and if you drill down into the soil, you can kind of see that repeat. The organic layers get thinner and thinner over time, as would be expected. But so these sidewalls just tend to stay just like that. So one thing is, hand sodding is very tiring. So we would make sure that we took plenty of breaks. I made sure to set the pace in the morning at a pace. I was like, this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. We're just going to chug along in this work so we can be sustainable over the 6 weeks that we were doing this work. And at lunch, oftentimes we would take a nap, find a good spot in the wind, and hopefully not have a bunch of bugs harassing us. So the takeaways on this work, so we used to do some elevation monitoring on some of these spots. We found that it wasn't even useful information because you can see where spots have subsided. And in really remote locations, especially the exploratory well pads, there's really no way to bring any backfill in. So even if you saw a problem, there wasn't really any way to address it. So we've ditched doing elevation monitoring. Soil testing, there's not much variation. So we found over and over again, it was like, well, it's low in phosphorus and nitrogen. It's low in phosphorus and nitrogen over and over again. And so we thought, well, what's the point in doing soil testing when we keep finding the same thing over and over again across a vast area? As I mentioned about transplanting tundra sod plugs, the donor sites are problematic. The biggest issue really is for wildlife, thinking about a caribou accidentally stepping into one of those holes and breaking its ankle. And they tend not to spread super quickly, especially when you're taking smallish plugs. If you can get larger pieces and plug them in from like a tundra sod donation site, then you can actually get some spreading of the vegetation. So originally on these trenches, before I was on the project, they were doing hydroseeding. There's a couple of downsides with seeding with grasses. Well, there's a handful of downsides. I'll just mention a few of them. One is that originally some of the grass species that were collected were used. The seed was collected on the North Slope. It was cultivated where I live in South Central Alaska, and then the seed was brought back north. And the idea of those original species is that they would grow for a short period of time and then die off and allow other vegetation to colonize. Well, we found that not to be the case. There were a couple things that happened, is that even though the grasses sometimes died, and often they do, their dead vegetative matter stays in the soil. And we're not sure if there's some kind of exudates or something that prevent other things from growing in, but we find that there's not a lot of colonization around individual grass clumps. Also, grass needs a lot of nutrients. And so sure, when you first plant it and you might fertilize with your hydroseed, that the nutrients drop away and then the grass dies. So it doesn't persist even in species that you want to persist. And then also it doesn't look anything like the surrounding areas. You can see in the upper picture, there may be individual grass sprigs throughout the tundra, but it's not a monoculture of grass. So it's just kind of an unnatural aesthetic. And then when it comes to forming that thick organic mat, grass is not going to be the solution. It's going to be more of these the mosses and other plants that grow in the tundra, especially the sedges that create that thick mat. We've had really good luck transplanting aquatic grasses. The hard part is getting the seed. So at this point, there's no commercially available source of seed. It's mostly Carex aquatilis. There is some commercially available seed in the lower 48, but morphologically it's different enough that we're not using it in Alaska. The public agencies have said, no, let's not introduce a different phenology or different morphology into our environment. So at this point, the only way that we can get seed is to convince a client to pay us to collect the seed. It's super labor intensive. Tim Cater is kind of at ABR is kind of the specialist in this. It's backbreaking work. It's really hard to find sites where there's available seed where the geese haven't eaten it all. It's very tricky, and it's also very expensive for the labor that's involved. I think it comes out to be, I forget the exact amount, but it's something like $1,800 a pound. And that was prices 8 years ago. So nowadays it would probably be quite a bit more. So we just don't have a good source of the seed, but when we have tried to use it, it works really well. Transplanting tundra sod has been wildly successful. In the upper photo, we actually transplanted tundra sod into this landscape. And until you get out of your truck and walk out onto the tundra, you can't tell the difference between the transplanted tundra sod and the native tundra. When you're standing on it, you can see it because you can see the edges of the chunks that we wove together in the ground. But it has been working very well in that location. We've been trying some willow staking in various locations. Sometimes it takes, sometimes it doesn't. I'm sure a lot of you who do wetland restoration have the same kind of experience. So we're still working with that and seeing what willows work in different locations. We tend to focus our willow collection focus on, oh, now it just jumped out of my head. It's the felt leaf willow. Anyway, Salix alexensis. Just because it grows really thick and robust and we're able to collect giant bundles of it. I did try transplanting Salix richardsonii, which seemed to be rather successful. It's just a smaller willow, and so it doesn't have as much, it's not as robust to resist water erosion. Indigenous seed collection is great if we can do it. It's just finding somebody to pay us to do it. And we've experimented with pre-vegetated mats, and there's some work right now in Alaska to try to continue that effort, collecting seed, growing out sedge mats to place out. While they may serve some function for thermal protection as insulation, they don't have that thick organic matter. So it still would take a while, but it's a huge jump start in the right direction. The lower picture just, it's a different project I worked on. It's the Heritage Tundra Garden in Utqiagvik, which is a village also called Barrow in northwestern Alaska. It's a botanical garden that I built a few years ago. So while this work is very hard and tricky, we also do try to make it fun and enjoyable, especially for the young folks, most of whom are not from Alaska, to come up and work. And staying at a camp for 6 weeks, it was very bonding. And we had a lot of comments and appreciation for our women working sign that we would have on the side of the road where we were working. And with that, I will conclude and open it to any questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Lorraine. Really enjoyed this presentation. And for everyone that's attending, what I'll do, we currently have one question in the hopper. I'll relay questions to Lorraine from our questions panel. And so if you have anything, please feel free to write it down in the panel. And the first question we have today is, could DOT work with the oil companies to share the cost of constructing new culverts along the highway?
Okay. Maybe I'm getting to that age where I see the impracticalities in front of the idealistic vision. And I got to say no. So when it comes, I mean, it all comes down to money, right? Like it's always about money. And so the highway is the responsibility of the DOT. And the oil companies are not going to spend money on highway maintenance. They expect the state of Alaska to take care of this highway. It was built originally, Wally Hickel was the first governor who pushed to have this highway built. It originally was gated and only oil service vehicles were allowed to travel up it. And my first time up the Dalton Highway was in 2006. And it was a rough drive, very rough. They say don't carry one spare tire, carry two. You need to carry fuel cans with you if your vehicle can't make it the 240 miles, or if you plan to idle at all in between the areas. And as it's a very expensive highway to maintain. The state does pour millions of dollars into it, and of course gets a lot of federal matching dollars. I'm sure you've all heard about how Alaska gets like a disproportionately huge amount of federal highway dollars for its work, but part of it is to maintain this particular highway. So yeah, the oil companies really are profit motivated. And so they want to make money. And it's even a problem in my work, just because my work doesn't make them any money. This is regulatory compliance work that I'm doing. So the agencies tell them, you have to fix this or you won't get another lease, or we won't renew your permits or something like that. So they're motivated from that perspective to do restoration work in the oil fields. And the oil field lands are also, they're leased from the state of Alaska. So they're also, they don't own the land. And they're just really there to pump oil. They really are not interested in highway maintenance. Honestly, I think the best thing to do would be to alter federal highway regulations and codes for Northern Alaska in particular, which is a big reach because there's not a lot of people in Alaska. And the folks in Washington, D.C., unless they come and visit, they often just can't wrap their heads around it. And honestly, what I've shown you today, I've talked to my SDA folks and I've said, have you been able to explain to people what it is we're doing? And they're like, no, we can't. And I've heard from many people that until they actually visit the Arctic, they're like, oh my gosh, now I get it. There's something about being there that changes it. I mean, I think it's true for most places. It's just, this is a really unique place for other locations. And in that vein, I'll just real quickly say, if you guys have heard about the Ambler Road in Alaska, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, oppose it, please, because the state of Alaska cannot afford to maintain an even more difficult highway that's even longer than this one, in addition to this one. And I think it's a terrible idea. I'll just say that.
Okay, thank you. We have a message, a question from Kalina. She says, thanks for the presentation, Lorraine. My question, it was nice that the one donor site was to be stripped away to allow for mining. In cases where you don't have that opportunity, what would you do with the exposed peat under the sod removal and new exposure of permafrost?
Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. So it happens, of course, gravel pits are open and we are not able to extract the tundra. It happened, ConocoPhillips is one of the big oil operators in Alaska, and their operations are further west. If you look up a map, it goes quite far west, and they're expanding further west. The Willow project, I know, has been in the news, and that's one of the Conoco projects. And in the design of the Willow project, they needed to open up new gravel pits. And so the environmental person at Conoco is actually very savvy and good at her job, and was interested in trying to figure out a way to get the tundra out. But this was a remote gravel site. It was only going to have an ice road built to it. So there was going to be no permanent road. And you really can't harvest tundra sod in the winter. It just chunks apart, it breaks up, it becomes kind of unwieldy and not worth the effort. And so in that situation, all they did was they dynamited it and pushed all the organic material to the side. They call it overburden. They just push it to the side, made those protective berms around the sides, and extracted the gravel, and that was that. So occasionally, yeah, we are not able to rescue the tundra sod. You also have to have somebody willing to pay for the harvest of tundra sod. So I've been actually working with some folks in the state of Alaska to incorporate this somehow into gravel mining regulations and require that tundra sod be harvested whenever possible, and to have some kind of fund, using bonds or something to pay for it, and then people can buy it from like a bank. So, that's in the works. It's always hard to change regulations. It's not the way we've always done it, kind of thing.
Interesting. So, this is a little bit of a side. I was kind of wondering, we're always like, not necessarily bombarded with like estimates of loss of permafrost and carbon storage and in various environments. And as this occurs, and you have subsidence occurring, and maybe you're getting more pothole lakes or something. Is there, first of all, a couple questions. Is there like, an active inventory of these losses in these these areas, and is the change, are there any changes that are like beneficial for wildlife with this happening?
Okay, on the first question as an inventory, so scientists have been marching all over the Arctic for a long time. And of course, carbon is a big topic of interest. I did my master's degree related to carbon and how much carbon is stored in the soil. Well, scientists and they put you poke holes in the ground, but this is a huge area, right? So there's been holes poked around, and of course, the more remote you get, the more expensive it is to get there and bring your scientific equipment and find funding to do that. So a lot of the concentration of studies has been along the road corridor or near various camps. There have been some that have been, they branch out. And so, yeah, people are trying to document how much carbon is stored in the soil, how much loss is happening. One thing that's happening, just to explain some of the losses, I explained about that active layer. So each year the ground thaws to some particular depth. Well, if you have a really warm summer, it's going to thaw a little deeper. If you have a really cold summer, it's going to thaw less. Well, over the years, it's just getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And each time you thaw a new area that hasn't been thawed for a long time, the microbial action in the ground increases dramatically. And so any recalcitrant carbon that's left there, the microbes go crazy on, and that's where you get this release of carbon dioxide out of the permafrost soils. A secondary part of that is anytime you mentioned about the new drained thaw lakes, there's all these thaw lakes, not drained thaw lakes, but thaw lakes. When you have water, of course, you get an anoxic environment. And if the lake is about 10 feet deep of water or more, it does not freeze all the way to the bottom. The ice that builds on the top of it ends up forming an insulation so the cold can't penetrate further. I'm not a lakes person, so I might have that a little off, but I know it doesn't freeze to the bottom. So you have this anoxic environment at the bottom and you have microbes going nuts down there, and that's where you get the releases of methane. So you've got this, methane and carbon dioxide both being released. It's still being worked on, being quantified. It seems like scientists keep upping the amount of carbon that's stored in permafrost as they do more discovery. But yeah, I mean, getting an actual number, as you know, from any type of mapping, you can only map certain spots and then extrapolate from there, and you may miss something. So that answers, I think, the carbon question. Any benefits to wildlife? Oh, I mean, that's a hard question to answer only because benefit deficit in nature and how nature works is so complicated. I mean, one change that's happening is that the tree line is marching north. So trees have been found quite a bit further north in the Brooks Range. So this photo you're looking at right now is on the northern side of the Brooks Range, right near Galbraith Lake. And a lot of these river valleys, they're finding trees have gone way up the river valleys north. And then the other thing that's happening is moose and beavers are following. So they're following that march north. Pretty early on, ravens and red foxes followed humans north, right? So you've got this tie together of climate change, human activity, habitats for animals. I'd say generally speaking, the caribou are suffering under climate change. One of the reasons is that in the winter, we're tending to get more warming events. And so you get an ice layer. So traditionally, caribou would dig in the snow, eat the lichens, feed themselves. When there's an ice layer, muskox and caribou both have a really hard time getting to the lichens, and the caribou and muskox population, well, caribou in particular, people are thinking they may be suffering from that. And then you've got predators, bears and wolves, and all playing in. So I don't know if I could say, I mean, there's no obvious benefit. The only time is when you have a new lake, you have more habitat for waterfowl. And in the spring, it is quite something to go up there as things are thawing and the birds are migrating through. There's tens of thousands of birds just surrounding you everywhere and making all this a cacophony. It's absolutely an amazing experience. And there's lots of water for them to settle on. So an additional pond here, I don't think is going to really make that much of a difference because there's just water everywhere. So and also I'm not a wildlife person, so that would probably be a better question for a wildlife person.
Fair enough, but I thought that was a pretty good pretty good answer. I mean, I covered a few things I wasn't even thinking of, and or quite a few things I should say. But yeah, I let's have one more question. And if anyone, we have one more question in the hopper, that is. And if anyone has anything preying on their questions, preying on their mind after this presentation, well, you can you can send your questions to Lorene at the email address listed on the screen. From an anonymous attendee, do you often work with student or young people conservation groups like SCA? And has that been a great asset to your projects?
Yeah, I love working with young people, and for multiple reasons. One is that they're strong and their backs still work, unlike me. My back is no longer happy. So there's that aspect of it. They're, able-bodied and young. But also there's just the youth enthusiasm, the fun involved with working with students, and then also just being able to give them an experience that's so outside their normal realm. I love working with students. I do a lot of mentoring especially for undergrads who are looking into graduate school. It's something that I love to work with students. I think it's invigorating and exciting. And the Student Conservation Association has been great to work with, although it's a little problematic from like the project management standpoint. It's not a very well-funded group. And so the project managers who are there, they're not getting paid very well. I don't think we got billed from them for like 9 months, which was a problem. They're very inexpensive, which is great comparative to other forms of labor. Last summer, I ended up just hiring a crew. So one of the folks was a returning SCA person, so I hired them as an employee. Another one had been a Dowell employee previously and worked on the project, and so I hired him. And my son also, he's 27 now, and he works for me as well. But yeah, I absolutely love working with students. It's really wonderful, and they are really the right people to be doing this kind of labor anyways. People who are 19 to 25 or 26 or so.
Sure. If you can keep them out of the water, right?
Oh no, we went in. We were up to our chests sometimes
Whew.
playing in the
Man, I
water.
can't imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of water.
All
Okay,
right.
well,
Well,
I will stop sharing so you can put up your exit slide.
okay. So just whoever is still left here, please visit our sponsors' websites. It's Cattails, Davy, and Ecobot. Like them. And we'd also like to for you to or for our next 2 webinars. We're going to have May 16th and June 20th. Please go to sws.org to register, and do not forget to answer the survey that will come your way after exiting this webinar. You'll receive credits for being here, and also there's a survey that has several questions. Your opinion really means a lot to us. If you could answer the survey as well. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. Thank you very much, Lorene. That was an incredible presentation, especially for somebody that lives in Florida. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone next month.